Thank you to the sponsors of this meeting and also to the organizers. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the nutritional aspects of the gut hormones. So you're going to hear a lot about the pharmacology of these hormones, but there's also, of course, the natural hormones that are in your body already. And there may be an interest out there in understanding what those look like after you eat a meal and whether that could be manipulated in some way. So my job today is to kind of walk you through some of that, to tee up the rest of the talks, and then also to contrast that a bit with the pharmacologic administration of these drugs. So you could begin to think about the difference between sort of natural hormone release versus pharmacologic. Yep. Just a quick disclosure, I have a company called Xenomet. It really was not relevant to today's talk, but just wanted to say that. All right. So this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it doesn't have to be. This is an overview of the GI tract. And I just wanted to put this slide up here to remind us all that the GI tract, the intestine, is a major endocrine organ. That's the take-home message from this. So you can ignore a lot of these other things down here, but just take home that many of these cells in the intestine actually secrete hormones, which are relevant to food intake regulation, energy expenditure, actually gastric emptying, GI motility, all those things. So these different cells are shown here: L cells, K cells, I cells, and so on and so forth. And up here on the very top is just to show you that nutrients of various kinds, as well as different metabolites such as bile acids after a meal, can trigger in different ways these different cells to produce native GLP-1, peptide YY, that should say PYY 3 through 36 as well, GIP, which you heard about, and cholecystokinin. So again, please don't memorize this. Just remember that the gut is an endocrine organ, okay? Way over here, it's hard for me to see actually, but I also want to point out the hormone ghrelin, which is released by the stomach. And a meal actually has the opposite effect with ghrelin. Ghrelin is actually reduced. This hormone is reduced following a meal. You'll see an X up here at the very upper right. Some people believe this is, most people believe this is a sort of a hunger regulating hormone. I don't believe it. I think it's more of a glucoregulatory hormone, but nevertheless, it's shown here. And then you can see over on the right-hand side as well how some of these other hormones, such as PYY and GLP-1, can actually go back and interact with ghrelin. The whole point being, this entire GI tract is an endocrine organ, and these hormones that are released or reduced after a meal can regulate one another. This is a simplified depiction of the abundance of different hormones from the top of the GI tract down to the colon. And where you see the darker black, that means that's where it's mostly secreted. Some of them are secreted along the entire tract, but mostly at the end, and some are more at the beginning. So that's the other thing we have to remember is as we're talking about these hormones in a natural state, where are they being actually released, and what are the signals that are causing that release in different parts of the GI tract? All right, so what happens in the body under a physiological setting? Because we're talking a lot about hormones that are given, or hormone-like molecules that are given pharmacologically. And I'd like to think, I'm a very biased, Justin, but I think this paper is probably the most comprehensive paper that's been published with respect to, what happens when you eat a normal meal to the entire suite of hormones in your body. So if you have any questions, you can look this paper up. It's from, I can't read it, Justin. What's the date? 2021. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. So let's get started. So in this particular case, we looked at people who had been on a low dairy diet or an adequate dairy diet. There's a whole reason behind that. We don't need to get into that today. And everybody had been losing weight. So this study asked a variety of questions with respect to hormone physiology. First, does your dietary pattern with respect to dairy in this case matter to your postprandial hormone physiology? And the second question to ask is, after you've lost weight, a significant amount of weight, does your hormone profile change following a meal? Okay. So this is what they ate for breakfast. And then this is what they ate for lunch. Again, don't memorize it. It's available in the paper. I can assure you that it's a sort of a mixed sort of dietary pattern. It would be very similar to what you and I might eat in this room for breakfast or for lunch. And we wanted to do that on purpose to understand exactly what happens in the body. Okay. Here's GLP-1 in the blood following breakfast, shown in this arrow here, following lunch with this arrow here. And on the left are people who had been on a low dairy consumption diet leading up to this point, and everybody had lost weight. In the black lines, the dashed lines are post-intervention. People had lost weight, and this is what those same people looked like before they had lost weight in the non-dashed lines. So I think you can appreciate that regardless of whether you had lost weight or not, your body's hormone release in response to the standardized meal challenge for breakfast and lunch is the same. For whatever reason, weight loss didn't matter with respect to how we respond. The other thing you may not appreciate, but we were not able to see a difference between the lead-in diet for dairy, but that's sort of irrelevant. You see the point here that GLP-1 is increased after breakfast, and then there's an added bump after lunch. And one of the things I'd like for you to appreciate, and please write this down, I'm kidding, is the concentration. The concentration here, I'm going to contrast this concentration that you see under normal physiological conditions with what you get after you inject one of these drugs, okay? So needless to say, it's a very low concentration. And I'll show a few more hormones just for good measure. Here's insulin after a meal. Here, after breakfast, after lunch, again, low dairy, adequate dairy, and so on. That's the expected pattern you might see. Some additional hormones would be ghrelin, which, as I mentioned, drops after breakfast and drops after lunch. Amylin is another hormone that's actually not talked about a whole lot, but it's also quite responsive to meals as well. Here's GIP-1, or GIP, pardon me. Bethany mentioned this earlier, very responsive to a food intake bout, and PYY336, a hunger satiety hormone, is actually increased, but very noisy, very variable. And then finally, CCK, cholecystokinin, just another hormone, increased after you eat and further sort of increased after lunch. And then here's the hunger score. As you might imagine, those drop after you eat in every case. So why did I show you all these graphs? I mean, just to make one single point, that while we're talking about GLP-1 at this session, we have to remember this is an integrated system that's impacting a lot of hormones after a meal. And it actually makes me start to wonder, what would these patterns look like for people who are on these GLP-1 receptor agonists? Wouldn't that be interesting to test? Okay, so let's get to the drug, and we'll do a couple slides and then finish up. So if you look at GLP-1, and Bethany, I think, alluded to this, but it can be degraded pretty rapidly by this enzyme called DPP-4. So those concentrations I showed you that were so small, very low and transient, are probably because DPP-4 is tearing up this enzyme pretty quickly in the blood. And that's what prompted the generation of these new drugs like Semaglutide, which are protected right here from DPP-4 in degradation by manipulations of some of these amino acids and adding a fatty acid and a carrier. So the drugs themselves are very different from the natural hormone, okay? And this protects it in the blood. So if you actually look at the PK profile, pharmacokinetics, this is the concentration in the blood after an injection. This is 4 hours later. And you can see for days and days and days, you see concentrations of the drug in the bloodstream. And that's why they work so well. They're always there. They're always doing what they need to do. But if you look at the concentration, it's about 1,000-fold higher than what you'd see for the natural hormone. Does that matter? I don't know. I just wanted to point that out. It may have us think a little bit differently about foods where we're trying to activate GLP-1 release through certain foods and functional foods. Is that actually going to be enough to have an effect relative to the drug? I don't think so, personally, but maybe. And then I think this is maybe my final slide. This is another PK profile from people who had taken a 0.5 milligram dose. And as you could see, again, the concentrations are far higher than the natural concentrations you'd see after a meal of GLP-1. And here's what I wanted to point out to this group in particular, kind of the take-home message. Look at the variability here after you dose this drug. The concentration in the blood is highly, highly variable. And again, the concentration is high for days on end. So from a foods perspective, you might start to think about, how do people respond maybe differently to these drugs, both in the concentration and the duration in their blood? And also, should we be thinking about foods in these people a little differently? Maybe when they're first taking or injecting the drug, maybe there's a different sort of nutrition that they might need relative to as the drug begins to go away in the bloodstream. Maybe the effects start to differ. So are we thinking too simplistically about nutrition? Do we actually need to put a time course component in this personalization? I just wanted to raise that for this group. All right. Take-home messages. The pharmacokinetics and blood levels differ significantly between natural and pharmacologic agents. I think we all knew that, but hopefully I really highlighted that for you. And this could be a major consideration when designing functional foods, either intended to trigger natural GLP-1 release or considering the timing and types of nutritional interventions. That may matter just as much as anything else. And I don't think we think about that enough. So with that, very variable blood levels in response to GLP-1 drugs warrant a personalized nutrition approach to optimize health. I wanted to make that point. Thank you very much.